It's my honor this morning to introduce our speaker, our lecturer. Bruce Ashford is the provost and professor of theology and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which for those of you who don't know, that's where I went to school. So I have a special place in my heart for Southeastern and for Bruce's leadership there. He is the author of several books, several that will be coming out in the next few years, but some of the ones he's already written include Every Square Inch, An Introduction to Cultural Engagement for Christians, One Nation Under God, A Christian Hope for American Politics, and he's also the editor of Theology and Practice of Mission. In addition to his writing projects, Dr. Ashford serves as a research fellow at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, a fellow in theology at the St. George's Center for Biblical and Public Theology, and a participant in the Dulles Colloquium of the Institute on Religion and Public Life. His primary interest is public theology. His secondary interests include philosophy of education, theology of mission, theological method, and contemporary theology. Like any good Kuyperian, Bruce has lots of interests. If you don't know what that means, we'll explain it later. He's married to Lauren, and he has two daughters. Together they have two daughters, Riley Noel and Anna Catherine, and a son, John Paul Kuyper. If you know your church history, you're seeing a theme here. He is also an elder at the Summit Church. And I just want to say, before he comes up, thank you to Bruce. Bruce is in high demand. He was even getting recruited to a very important event in Chicago yesterday, and was committed to joining us. And so I'm thankful for Bruce. I'm thankful for his friendship, and we're in for a treat this morning. So join me in welcoming Bruce Ashford.
Well, good morning. So this is, I think, the third time I've been to Liberty in the past decade or so. I had a chance to do convocation 6 or 8 years ago and a talk last year and then here this year. And I found you to be a very hospitable campus, very smart campus, and grateful to be here. So the title that we've prepared for my talk today is Public Witness in a Secular Age, a Theological Vision for Christianity and Politics. Alternatively, it could be titled Tailoring Christian Politics for Our Secular Age, playing off the last name of a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor. So I think the past decade or so has put on full display the dysfunctional, mephitic, and effluvial travesty that is American politics and public life. We've seen, I think, the disintegration of both major political parties, usually the inability of Congress to carry on a sustained or constructive debate on matters of grave national significance, escalation of race-related crimes and unrest, blatant disregard for human dignity, calloused and flippant attitude of Planned Parenthood Federation of America executives toward the dismemberment of unborn babies and the sale of their body parts, increasingly tribal politics in which a nation is polarized into one camp that is farther to the left than Sam Donaldson's part. You have to be of a certain age to get that one. And another camp that is equally distant on the other side. But in the midst of what seems like the circumambient imbecility of American politics and public life, there's one theme or thread that I want to pull out today that's very significant, and we're going to focus on this thread, and that is the decentering of historic Christianity, socially, culturally, and politically. That what we have seen over the past 50 or 60 years, and then I think especially over the past 10, is the rise of a post-Christian left and to some extent a post-Christian right. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian, foresaw this 50 years ago when he spoke of the Western world as a world come of age. And this was not a compliment. He was saying that we were a world that thought we were now mature enough to live life and to manage it without reference to God. The great Jewish American sociologist Philip Rieff, who was rock star public intellectual in the 1970s and very much a progressive at that time, dropped out of the public eye for about 30 years, and during that time worked on his magnum opus that he published in 2006, 7, and 8, a trilogy entitled the Sacred Order Social Order Trilogy. And in that trilogy, the first volume was entitled My Life Among the Death Works. And in this volume, he argued that the West in general, and America in particular, are in the midst of a historically unprecedented attempt to remove or to unsever or decouple sacred order from social order. When he says sacred order, he means religious ordering, and by social order, he means society. So an attempt to sever the tie between religion and society. So as he sees it, we are in the middle of a third era in human history. The first era was predominantly polytheistic. The second era was predominantly monotheistic. And this third era is in some sort of a manner atheistic. Not atheistic per se, but just if we could just say atheistic. And what he says is that certain people with cultural power in the West and in the United States over the past decades have done everything they can to loosen the hold that religion might have over the public imagination. And as Reef sees it, sacred order or religion has always and forever in history shaped social order and has done so, and this is important, by means of cultural institutions, cultural products, and cultural influencers. What that means, if I could translate it into everyday language, is that religion shapes cultural institutions like legal systems, families, churches, educational institutions, and that those institutions then in turn shape individuals. But what has happened now is that certain elite have tried to rip, if you will, the sacred rug out from underneath social order, leaving social order to float on its own. And when that happens, he says, cultural products become, and cultural institutions become what he calls death works. And instead of bringing life, vitality to society, brings death and decay. But I think the most important person for us today is to focus on a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, who has written a number of different books, all of which are important. But the one we're going to focus on today is a big volume entitled A Secular Age. It's a beast, and so it's about 800 pages. I wouldn't recommend reading it late at night while you're in bed for fear that you will doze off and be crushed to death mid-sentence. So you want to have it firmly on a table in case that happens, because it's a big one. But it's a very important book, and in this book, what Taylor does better than Reef has a lot of strengths, but what Taylor does is he gets inside the psyche of a person who lives in our secular age. Inside the psyche of a person who says they're a Christian or a person who says they're not. He gets inside of their psyche, and I want to talk about that a little bit this morning before going on to say, listen, here's how we could politic as Christians in a secular age, the type of secular age that Reef and especially Taylor describe. So Taylor argues that we're in a situation now where Christianity, historic Christianity, really has an implausible feel in our nation. And that even people who are Christians feel that some of its most culturally offensive beliefs are implausible. Even if we kind of believe it and affirm it, it still feels implausible. And sometimes even unimaginable. That when somebody learns of some aspect of historic Christian teaching, especially sexual morality, because for Americans, everything comes down to unfettered freedom, being unnormed socially or morally by anything at all, especially sexually. It all comes down to the genitals. Almost everything comes down to the genitals. That people just think, this is just unimaginable. How could you possibly believe this? It's not just that you're wrong, it's that you're also bad. And Taylor says this is because Westerners in general, and Americans in particular, are beginning to live life from within what he calls the immanent frame. What is the immanent frame? It's a frame of reference in which there are nothing that really transcends. There's nothing transcendent. Even if we affirm God's existence, and even fervently in the midst of worship at our church, that the way we live, we really sort of exclude that as a reality. Even if we affirm Christian moral teaching, even if we do these things, we're living within the immanent frame. Atheist, agnostic, Christian, Jew, we're living within the immanent frame. So, and this immanent frame has a feel to it. And here's what it feels like. It's not just that Christianity has been displaced from the default. It's that Christianity is merely one option among many, and it's positively contested by all the other options. So it doesn't seem to have any significant weight to it, or to be all that distinctive, other than it's very offensive to people who care about, whose prime care and concern in life is to live their life unfettered, free from any sort of norm. He says that we're fragilized and cross-pressured. Here's what he means by fragilized. Everybody, atheist, Jew, Christian, agnostic, our belief system is fragile, internally fragile. Because no matter how heated our rhetoric is about what we believe, inside, we know things are a little more fragile, that we're not exactly sure of what we believe. The Christian lives in an environment that in nearly every way works against his belief. But the atheist or agnostic lives in the midst of a world where they're constantly haunted by transcendence. Isn't there something more? Doesn't my life have meaning beyond being an animal who is born and then dies one day? So we're fragilized, and at the same time we're cross-pressured. So by cross-pressured, he means that even while we're internally fragile, we're being pressured from every side by other competing belief systems. So how do we respond? Here's what Taylor says. I think this is very good advice. He says that Christians should avoid the error of secular humanists on the one hand and from fundamentalists on the other, and that is one of presenting our views in a way that is angry or smugly condescending. And then instead we should present our faith humbly and with sensitivity to a cross-pressured and fragilized world. So, I think Taylor's account of modernity is richly suggestive and very helpful for Christians who want to be a witness in politics and public life. Now, I want to stop for a minute and mention a guy named Leslie Newbegin for a minute, a man named Leslie, all right? So this man has been it's like a boy named Sue, but different, has been incredibly influential on me. He was a British missionary to India for about 30 years. When he returned from India to live in England, he realized that he had every bit as much of a mission task on his hand as he did in India, and maybe more. And for the next 30 years of his life, published 25 or 30 books, all toward the end of trying to bring the West into a missionary encounter with the gospel. And that's one in which we don't mock and condescend toward people who don't believe what we believe, in which we don't stand at the top of the mountain and thunder from above. We let God do that. But where we enter into our social and cultural context and we listen. We give respect and dignity to the other person, even if the other person believes very differently from us, and even if that person is attacking us. And then we do that, after doing that social listening and that cultural exegesis, we then bring the gospel in its fullness into an interface with our social and cultural context. And in my own life, over the past few years, I've taken a turn toward asking an even more specific question, which is this: how can I play my own small role in helping bring the United States, and especially the right in the United States, because I'm on the right, I'm a conservative, into a missionary encounter with the gospel? What would that look like? And I'm going to try to explore that for the next 20 minutes or so. What is politics? Politics, simply put, is something like this. It is the art and or science of attempting to persuade other citizens and or political leaders about matters of public significance. That's a good general definition of politics. There are multiple different ways of defining it. It's a fairly general way, and you'll find something like that in any dictionary of politics that's written in the West. So how can we do that? The early church had to do it. They had to persuade other citizens. Sometimes they tried to persuade political leaders. And they had to do it in a very antagonistic and hostile environment, much more than the one we live in. And they managed to declare that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. Very dangerous thing to do. And they managed to be winsome and persuasive, compelling. And they won the day. It took a few hundred years, but in different ways, they won the day. And how can we do that in our own day? How can we stand in a public square full of vitriol with people for whom sometimes bad reason and sometimes good reason are cynical about Christianity, or at least cynical about institutionalized forms of it or aspects of it? How can we do that today? I'm going to argue that the remedy is not merely intellectual. The intellectual piece is definitely a part of it. It's not merely intellectual, but it's going to have to do with the communities we build. It's going to have to do with our public demeanors. It's going to have to do with whether our action matches our words. And so I want to offer 5 things, at least 5 things. There are other things than the 5 that I list, but I think there are 5 I'm going to list in a moment 5 things that we ought to do. Before I do that, very quickly, I want to talk about the church as an organization and as an organism. These are 2 aspects of what it means to be the church. So the church is, first of all, an organization that gathers on Sunday mornings, all right? And so Taylor, in an essay entitled To Follow a Rule, Charles Taylor, makes the point that reason-giving, intellectual reasons, can only be a part of what it is that we do when we give witness to Christ. That we're going to have to build larger communities that interact in deeply Christian ways with one another and with the world, rather than us being merely individuals who offer reasons in public. And so that is the church. And when the church gathers, it is a deeply political assembly. So there is one sense in which I think it is not political, and another sense in which I think it is deeply political. I do not think that the church gathered is political in the sense that it's a public policy think tank. I think the church is neither competent nor called to do that. And that the Bible rarely speaks directly to policy issues in a 21st century democratic republic, like on the referendum about the sewage plant, option A, B, or C. The Bible really doesn't speak directly to that. There may be some general principles somewhere, but it doesn't speak directly. So the local church is not political in that manner, but it is deeply political in that when we gather on Sunday mornings, we gather to declare, or we ought to be declaring, through word and through table, that Jesus is Lord, and by extension that Caesar is not. This is a profound and powerful kingdom-challenging question. That Christ is the king, and that any allegiance that we have to our nation state, to a political party, or to any person or thing other than Christ, any allegiance is secondary and is held tentatively in light of that allegiance. And our declaration that Christ is King on Sunday morning nourishes our primary political identity, and our primary political identity is neither Democrat nor Republican, nor Libertarian Party, nor Green Party, nor is it an ideology like nationalism or conservatism, progressivism, or socialism, or any of the isms. That primarily our identity is ambassador of the King, of the cosmic King. And the church also incubates in us certain virtues and dispositions. And then finally, I want to say this, that when the church gathers, it has a political power. And that power is twofold. That power is the proclamation of the gospel, that Jesus is Lord and Congress is not. Jesus is Lord and the president is not. Jesus is Lord and a preferred political party is not. And also, it has the power of being a preview of Christ's kingdom, of being a community that represents the fact that one day Christ will return, and when he returns, he will install a one-world government and a one-party system with him at the head. And justice, as the great prophet said, and as Martin Luther King said, will roll down like the waters. And we are the preview of that kingdom. And the inner life of the church ought to be a foretaste of that kingdom. You ever been watching a TV show and then it's time for commercials and there's a preview of a movie that's going to come out later in the summer, and the director and producer have taken the best 1 or 2 scenes, maybe the only 2 good scenes in the entire movie, and they put them in that 30-second or 1-minute preview to whet your taste buds and make you want to go and see the movie. And that the inner life of the church ought to be a preview, an imperfect one, of course, but a preview of his coming kingdom. So the church is an organization that gathers. But then finally, the church is an organism that scatters out into society throughout the week. And as an organism, I think we should be doing at least 5 things if we want to be public witnesses in our public engagements, including our more specifically political engagements. Josh, if you would, could you tell me about how much time I've got left?
You've got 25 minutes into 25.
Good, we're in great shape. All right, we'll do it in less than 25, probably. I've been told that Terry Tate has been hired to tackle me if I don't land on time. Do you guys know who Terry Tate is? The linebacker that on the commercials? No? Not funny? Okay. I'll try to make funny jokes next time. All right, so 5 things. The first thing that we're going to need to do as believers is to reimagine the political, all right? To help reshape the West's political imagination. If you just take the United States for a moment, there are a lot of people who sit at home all day long and have blaring in the background their favorite cable news network, or maybe even worse, a live-streamed website that doesn't even rise to the level of a cable news network. And that narrative shapes them comprehensively in a way that the church could barely compete, even if it's a good cable news network and a preferred one. And so one of the things we can do as a pushback is to try in many different ways to make clear that the Bible's narrative of the world is the master narrative, and that every other narrative of the world is a bit player that falls underneath the scope of the Bible's narrative. That the Bible's narrative of the world is the true story of the whole world, not the CNN or the Fox or the CNBC narrative of the world. Another way of doing that is the Bible talks in many different ways in Old Testament and New about the pervasive presence of idols. Now idols, what is an idol? An idol is just any good thing that God has created that we have elevated to a level of ultimacy. We've absolutized it. And so the thing itself is not bad, or the person or the thing that we idolize, or the idea that we idolize. It's the fact that we've elevated it to ultimacy, that we've absolutized it. And so there's 2 ways we can do idol excavation. And I warn you, this will make people very uncomfortable, and you're going to have to navigate people being very angry at you when you do this, precisely because you're messing with their idols, messing with your own idols, our own idols. One way that you can do that is you can pick out perennial idols, sex and money and power, and then show how those idols have warped and twisted our public life and shaped the way we think in bad directions. Another way of doing it in the political realm is to take any given modern political ideology, classical liberalism and libertarianism, nationalism, socialism, conservatism, progressivism, all of the isms, and each one of them is going to tend toward idolatry. And we can, if you want, if during Q&A time, if you want to ask about that, we can go into more detail, a little bit more detail on each of those. And so you can locate the idol that operates beneath the ideology and to try to help untwist what has been twisted by the absolutization of something. And then we can make clear in different ways to anyone who watches us that we may have a tentative allegiance to a political party. I'm a registered Republican. That we may have a tentative embrace of certain ideology. I don't want to say ideology, but certain impulses. I'm on the right-hand part of the spectrum. I'm a brand of a conservative. And yet at the same time, those allegiances are tentative in light of my allegiance to Christ. And that's always going to, I'm always going to be saying something like this: occupants to Caesar's throne come and go, but only Jesus remains forever. Okay, so we want to reimagine the political. Number 2, I think we're going to want to, we want to reframe public issues. If Westerners in general, and Americans in particular, tend to live life within the immanent frame, then public issues are going to be framed within the immanent frame. That's a tautology. That's okay. And if you'll just give me linguistic license. And if all public issues are framed in an immanent manner, then we have the opportunity to reframe them in light of transcendence. I think the Christian faith gives us unique and I think interesting ways of reframing any issue. Just to pick one out of the bag for a moment, power. That we ought to be a people who consistently, to our shame or not, but we ought to be a people who consistently, when we are given power, use that power to protect the oppressed, to empower those who need to be empowered, and instead of just centering ourselves, to decenter the self. I'm not making a statement. Don't read anything more into my statement. I'm not making a Democratic or Republican statement there. I'm just saying that when we have power, we use it to serve. I mean, there are lots of people we can draw upon. Sociologists such as Robert Putnam at Harvard, Philip Reef, theologians and philosophers to help do that. Another thing that we can do is we can speak to the moral anxiety of our age. You'll notice that we live in an age where it's unimaginable and even implausible for most people to believe the moral framework taught by Christianity. And in a sense, there is on the one hand a disbelief in moral absolutes because we think that people ought to be unencumbered from any type of norms, such that Christians are even affected by this. There ought to be no norms, and very few, if any, norms in society. But then on the other hand, we can't live in a world that doesn't have norms, so there's this anxious drive to create codes of behavior. And if you don't comply with the codes of behavior, you're out. But because these codes of behavior aren't underlain by moral absolutes, they're just rules that admit of no exception, and they become totalizing and domineering. There's an authoritarian sort of impulse that comes with these codes of permission and prohibition. And what we end up doing is just shouting each other down in the absence of moral absolutes. And we've got to find ways, I think, instead of having confident smugness or a righteous wrath, and there is a righteous wrath, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we have to find ways of approaching our society the way a missionary would approach people in a missions context, rather than a reprimander from the tall heights of culture. Number 3, reforming public dispositions. I think we have had the opportunity over the past couple of years, and I think for the most part we've lost the opportunity. Maybe we can regain it. The United States we've had incivility on and off throughout the entire course of our nation's life. I think it was Matthew Griswold, not Clark Griswold, but Matthew. I think it was a Congressman Griswold who took a cane and beat another congressman about the head. Now, I thought that was uncivil, and that was years ago. But so we've had civility and incivility and tides of it, but we've reached kind of a higher level of incivility in the past few years. And I think Christians have an opportunity. We've almost lost it. Maybe we can regain it. To interact publicly in a way that is very different from the way most people interact publicly. That in the midst of the vitriol and the inanity, the insults and the mockery and the threats, kind of weaponized, tribalized insult factories that our institutions and media outlets have become, that we have an opportunity to display a cruciform attitude of strength and humility at the same time. Confident humility. I think it's Tim Keller that says truth without grace makes you a political bully. Grace without truth makes you a political wimp or non-entity. And that Jesus and the apostles, Jesus was the perfect combination of truth and grace. We've got a chance to do that. I write for Fox News Opinion. I'm not paid by them, but I write for them as a freelance writer very often. And I don't fit exactly with the winds these days. And I receive a lot of feedback from the left and the right by my email inbox and by comment chains. Most of it is insults and mockery, sometimes threats. Very little of it is reasonable. And it's very difficult for me to keep a leash on myself when people say the sorts of things to me that they say, but I remind myself, and we need to remind ourselves, that we have an opportunity to respond in a different manner than how we've been treated. If Jesus, the cosmic king of the universe, could come to earth as a homeless itinerant teacher and have no place for his head to rest, the least we can do is stand there in the moment and draw upon the Spirit of God for strength and grace and not respond to people in kind, right? Number 4, reshaping political activism. Over the course of the past century, I think conservative Americans and progressive Americans have put all of their eggs, or most of their eggs, in the basket of short-term political activism. I think that's a mistake. I don't think there's a problem with political activism, and I don't think there's a problem with short-term political activism, but there is a problem with putting most or all of our eggs in the basket of short-term political activism. What do I mean? Well, I mean two things. I don't think we should reduce culture to politics. A lot of times when people hear culture, there's problems in culture, they think politics. And by the way, if you're a political conservative, that's a terrible way to think about it. Political conservatism historically has said that politics, the realm of politics and the realm of government, should be very small, and that it shouldn't dwarf and overwhelm culture. The culture is made up of many institutions, the arts, the sciences, education, family, church, and the politics should be one realm alongside of all of those. And I think as a believer, I think that's exactly right. That's one thing where I really agree with historic conservatism, is that we want to bring renewal to all of these social and cultural institutions. All right? So let's not reduce our influence to politics. It's an awful way of skewing the reality that God's given us. We don't want the state to become like a giant octopus on steroids, reaching its tentacles into every square inch of our existence in an increasingly authoritarian manner. So we don't want to reduce culture to politics, but we also don't want to reduce politics to short-term activism. The problem, and short-term activism is okay when rightly done, but when we put all of our hopes in short-term activism, winning the next election, because for the past 50 years, both sides have said the next election seals America's destiny forever. If we don't get this election, if we don't do such and such, it is over. When we do that, we sacrifice our long-term witness on the altar. We're tempted to sacrifice long-term witness on the altar of short-term political activism. I think that's very dangerous. Remember, our first allegiance is not to a party or an ideology. Our first allegiance is to Christ. And so we can have strategic or tactical relationships, I think, with ideologies or parties, but our ultimate relationship is to Christ. And so we always stand with a little bit of a critical distance, even if we're throwing ourselves into party involvement. And then finally, we need to recover the lost art of Christian persuasion. Os Guinness wrote a wonderful book entitled Fool's Talk. The subtitle was something like this, Recovering the Lost Art of Christian Persuasion, something like that, in which he argued that we should go back to the early church and realize that the early church talked about dissuasoria and persuasoria. Dissuasoria, or the way of the closed fist, is only one tool that Christians have. We also have persuasoria, which is the way of the open hand. The way of the closed fist is the way they described defensive apologetics against people who are intellectually attacking the faith, that you could then bring equally tough intellectual arguments back to bear and sort of punch back. But persuasoria, the way of the open hand, was a way of inviting people in, listening, seeing them for who they are as humans, and then bringing the gospel into an interface with their existence as humans. And that we need to recover the way of the open hand. I think he's right on that account. Let me offer for you for just a moment, and I'm concluding now. I want to read to you a quote from Leslie Newbigin, and then offer a couple of small reflections, and we will conclude my bloviation for the morning, and we'll have a time of Q&A if you'd like to do that. Newbigin says this: "The call for the church is to enter vigorously into the struggle for truth in the public domain. We cannot look for the security which would be ours in a restored Christendom. It probably won't happen. Maybe it will, but we can't count on it. And there were problems with Christendom anyway. Nor can we continue to accept the security which is offered in an agnostic pluralism. Oh, each to their own, liberty, no norms for anybody. That's not going very well either. Society has to have norms. Instead, he says, we are called, I think, to bring our faith into the public arena, to publish it, if you will. To put it at risk in the encounter with other faiths and ideologies in open debate and argument." And he didn't say anything about insults, threats, or mockery. I was kept looking for it, but it never appeared. It didn't say to do that. And to put it into the risky business of discovering what Christian obedience means in radically new circumstances and radically human cultures. So I think the way I want to conclude is this. For those of us of a certain age, I'm 43, for those in their 40s and older, some of us, I think, struggle with kind of resenting the moment we live in. We see some of the ugliness of our moment, and we resent it. That things could be the way they were 20 years ago, which in some respects was better than it is now. But I think the challenge for all of us is not to resent the moment, but to embrace it. It's the moment that God has given us. And if Christ could embrace his moment, which included him being slaughtered mercilessly and nakedly in a public cross, wandering as a homeless itinerant teacher, then we can embrace our own moment, can't we? And embrace the challenge to be at the heart of every good movement of social, cultural, and political concern. Because, and I want you to hear me, when we meet the Lord one day, I'll speak for myself. When I meet the Lord one day, I will meet him as an American. Not primarily as an American, primarily as his son and as his ambassador, but secondarily as an American, because he placed me here. And so I want to be faithful to the context in which he has placed me. I don't want to withdraw entirely from the public square and leave it on its own when I've got something I can bring to bear, something good to offer. I don't want to charge into it with sort of angry activism, borrowing the principles and methods of secular ideologies and political parties, but instead to ask consistently, how can I tailor my public engagement and my politics in light of my Christian faith and in the midst of this secular age? Dr. Chetreau, what should I do? Should I stay here?
Thanks, Bruce, for that lecture. We're going to have a time of Q&A. Let me frame this Q&A a little bit. We need questions that are questions. I know that's a novel, but in other words, if you have a statement that leads up to the question, that's fine. But let's actually ask a question, and then try to be concise in your question. We don't, let's follow the model that Dr. Ashford just gave us, and that. Let's when we talk politics, it can easily get ad hominem about personalities, or of course, if you watch the news, there's a lot going on right now. Those aren't necessarily completely off the table, but let's not focus on necessarily personalities in this kind of conversation. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask a question, okay, to lead us off. And I know I have some of my students here, and a few years ago with the fellowship with the Center for Apologetics and Cultural Engagement, we worked through James Hunter's book, To Change the World. I know you're familiar with that. And towards the end of it, he has a lot of the same things, that you were saying, he's saying through his book. The problem with everything's political, so we can't just be public. But one of the things he suggests, as we read him, was that there should be kind of this moratorium on politics, because Christians have not done this well. I just wonder. Obviously, you're very much wanting to call for some kind of political engagement. And yet you do have some of the same concerns as Hunter, as I listen to you. So I wonder if you could speak to that and maybe kind of respond to Hunter, because I know we have some students who might be agreeing and then therefore just jump out of the political arena altogether.
Yeah, great question. So Hunter's book, very, very good book, so much to gain from it. It is a particular school of sociology that originated in France and that is contested by other schools of sociology. And so I'm not a sociologist and have a hard time adjudicating some of the inner dynamics of that. But let me just address that particular question. So as I see it, if I could give an analogy for a moment, in Genesis chapter 1, when the Bible talks about God creating different kinds of animals, right? Different kinds of vegetation, I think in the same way that when we take patterns in the Bible and compare and place them over patterns in history, we can see that God created different kinds of culture, each having its own center and its own circumference. In other words, each having its own unique reason for existence and at the same time limits to its jurisdiction. Each thing called to do its own thing and not to do everybody else's thing. And so I think the different kinds of culture would be art, science, education, politics, sports and competition, business and entrepreneurship, marriage and family, church and mosque. These are some of the different spheres of culture, if you will. And I think what we want to realize is that each of these spheres has a reason for being, that God wants it to exist. I think all of these spheres would have existed even if there had been no fall. And you're welcome to challenge me on that one, and we can have some fun talking about that. But I think each has its own God-given reason for existence. and limits to its jurisdiction, and that it shouldn't be meddling where it has no business meddling. And under that paradigm, the political realm has a unique reason for its existence, and I don't think it ought to ever be abandoned unless it's just taken from us and we're not allowed to participate. But even then, if it were taken from us, if our voting cards were taken from us in this democratic republic, being political is much more than voting or getting on television and having an argument. It can be very localized and interpersonal. It's wanting the best in your context and working for the best. And so I don't want anyone to ever withdraw or disengage, but I think Hunter's right that we ought to seriously rethink how we engage. And maybe there could be a little bit of pullback here and there until we learn how to do it better. And 3 questions I think that should be asked in any of these kinds of culture or spheres of culture. What is God's creational design for it? How has it been corrupted and misdirected by sin? And how can we sort of bring healing and redirection to that which has been corrupted and misdirected? Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes, if I can just add on to that, Bruce, if you allow me here, I guess I can because we're hosting you. Is that sometimes students think of like political means making political arguments on Facebook, whereas a more political act could be something along the lines of volunteering in your local community or showing up to a city council meeting and interacting with leadership there. So really, politics can start and maybe even should start locally, and we kind of open up our imaginations as Christians of different ways to be political other than maybe social media or maybe some of the traditional ways we think of politics. So okay, now I'm going to thanks for affirming that too. I hope that was in line with what you were saying. I'm going to open up to you guys, so if you have a question, just please raise your hand and I'll take it. Yeah, go ahead. Just speak up, and then I will try to summarize what you say so everyone else can hear and make sure Bruce can hear, and then I'll let him take it from me. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Bruce said that we tend, with different ideologies, they tend to influence how we see the world, and if we absolutize those, then it ends up hurting our Christian witness. So then how does Christianity and a Christian worldview actually interact with these different ideologies? Is that fair? Okay.
So the way I define an ideology, and it's not without precedent, I draw upon a political scientist named David Koyzis in a book entitled Political Visions and Illusions, and upon an entire sort of historic stream of thought in theology and politics, is an ideology is something that by its definition tends to absolutize some aspect of the created order. And in absolutizing it, whatever it is they absolutize becomes a kind of cudgel or a club that will beat down other aspects of God's good creation. So let's go through some different modern political ideologies one by one. I'm going to have to go very quickly, but I can recommend, I've written a couple of articles on this. David Koyzis' book is tremendous. So classical liberalism, not what we call liberalism in America, but classical liberalism. In other words, the Constitution of the United States of America is classical liberalism. Classical liberalism and libertarianism tend to absolutize a certain kind of liberty in which we are unencumbered by any kind of norms. Libertarianism of the left, at its extreme, wants no moral norms of any sort. Libertarianism of the right, at its extreme, wants no economic norms and sometimes no moral norms of any sort, politically. Socialism tends to absolutize material equality and community ownership of property. Nationalism tends to absolutize either the nation state itself and treat it like a god, or an ethnic group within the nation state. There's all the different types of nationalisms. Conservatism tends to absolutize cultural heritage. And since probably many of us in this room are conservatives, in a broad sense, I'm a conservative, but I'm a Christian who tries to never tries to not absolutize anything other than Christ. But, the problem with conservatism is it doesn't have moral absolutes of its own historically. And it has to, when it comes time to, for example, abolish slavery, it has to rummage around in a bag to find some transcendent norms. And it found it with Christianity. And progressivism is the opposite. It makes cultural heritage, as a general rule, evil. And that what we want to do is take grand, sort of sometimes take these revolutionary steps towards social change and social engineering. It's a kind of messianic in nature in that sense. I've probably missed an ism or two here. I don't remember what I've covered or haven't. But I think the ideologies tend to be, in their pure forms, idolatrous. And what we want to do as believers is I fit pretty well in a lot of ways with the kind of American conservatism of the 80s and 90s and in the early 2000s, a Reagan-type conservatism. But even then, there are ways in which my Christianity caused me to express it differently or to reject certain items of it. So I think all that to say, and I can't explain it fully, it's such a complicated topic, that if Christ is who we have absolutized, if we've ascribed ultimacy to him, it will help keeping us from ascribing ultimacy to an idea or a person or a movement within the immanent frame. Thank you. Good question.
Thanks, Tim, for the question and Bruce for the reply. Is there another question? So the question was, how should we respond to challenges to Christian sexual ethics?
Yeah, so the tough thing is that Western nations, as much as I like the classical political liberal arrangement, the reason classical liberalism succeeded for the first couple hundred years relatively, with big failures like slavery, pretty big failure. But the reason it succeeded is because it was paired with strong cultural institutions that inculcated virtue into people. We're at a situation now where those institutions have been weakened, not beyond repair, but they have been seriously weakened. And so as believers who understand that when you flout God's moral teaching, things are going to go bad, and they're going to go bad for society as a whole, how do we respond? I don't think our first response is political. I'm a conservative. I'd rather not use the political hammer if I don't have to. I'd rather not give even more power to the overweening state than it already has, because once you give it to them, they're off to the races, and you never get it back. So my strong encouragement would be for us to rebuild our cultural institutions. And in rebuilding those institutions and in interacting in localized manners with real people, usually not through Facebook, usually face-to-face preferably, that we interact with this combination of grace and truth, that we find ways of being compelling and persuasive, that we pray, and that I think that the reformation of our society that we need is going to be long-term, and it will probably happen slowly. It will happen in localized and personal ways and through cultural institutions, not necessarily always through politics. At the political level, I would like to legally clear out protections for all people, actually, religious exercise and freedom of speech, including Christians, because anyone who's paid attention to the courts over the past 50 years knows that things have been angling in a direction that is not very favorable at all toward Christian belief. So there's a brief answer. Do we have time for another question?
Yeah. We got time for one more, and I want to go to the woman right behind you. She had a question, yeah. It's some of the problem that you see are basically we don't even know how to interact with each other as Christians, and so there's this kind of negativity amongst Christians. Okay. So even publicly in political engagement, you'll have two people identifying as Christians and yet attacking each other. So yeah, how do we respond to that?
So this is a hugely important question. And I want to try to answer it briefly, but we could go after this one for an hour. That's how good of a question it is. I think this is our moment to be different. And we have got to find ways of standing there in the moment, even when fellow Christians are insulting and mocking us, representing us with partial truths or entire falsehoods. This is happening on both sides of the spectrum. I mean, it is half-truths, lies, mockery, insults, and even threats, almost all the way down on both sides of the spectrum. And we've got to find a way, a more excellent way, that's biblical language, And I think it starts in face-to-face conversations. I think when you enter into a Facebook discussion, I don't think it's wrong. It's already happening. So I enter in on purpose sometimes to be just very careful how you use words. We're in an era where our politicians don't use words with care and purposefully use them in bad and careless manners. And we have to care about words and give people respect. Even on social media, there is something about social media that makes people in general, and even Christians, think that we can take everything we've ever been taught at church about morality and disposition and throw it in the trash can and become an absolute jerk, as they say. And so we have got to find a more excellent way, a different way of doing this, and it's difficult. So I have a Facebook author page, and when I post an article, one day it will be the nasty people on the right, and another day it'll be the nasty people on the left. And out of 75 or 100 comments, maybe 80% of them will be, they may or may not have read the article, it's just insults and mockery. But I've found this, that when I take a little bit of time, and I answer some of these on purpose because I want people to watch how I interact. When I take time to respond and I open with a sentence that affirms something about what they said, almost anybody has something that can be confirmed. Some concern that's evident, that's a good concern, even if I don't like their approach to that concern. If I'll open with an affirmation, give a kind and hopefully reasonable answer, and close with an affirmation and thanking them, about 50% of the time I receive back a respectful and reasonable response, even if it's a complete disagreement. The other 50% of the time, the person acts according to who they are. A jerk. So social media, I think, is very important. If you spend time on it, do it as a missionary. You got to be different. And then I've probably answered for long enough. Great. I've written a ton. I've got a website, bruceashford.net. I've written on all of these issues, all of the ideologies, the civility, public deportment. I write a lot with Fox News Opinion, a little bit with Heritage Foundation, Daily Signal, and a little bit with Daily Caller. I'd love to have you interact with me a little bit there. And I've got a book coming out, if I could tell you about it. It's coming out June the 1st, called Letters to an American Christian. And I have written 27 letters, pretend letters, to a hypothetical college student at DuPont University, think Duke University, on all of these topics. And I had fun. It's my first trade book. I get to make jokes, cultural references, and try to coax a college student into doing better than his parents, and the politicians, and the radio talk show hosts, and the TV commentators, and many of our religious leaders, and better than I've done. Because our hope is in Generation Z, I think it is, that you're called these days. They've got 2 or 3 different names for you. Generation Z and the millennials. This is your nation now. It's yours. I mean, it's God's, but you're here to serve it. So
let's give Dr. Ashford a round of applause.